discussed the Great Migration and the Great War. Now we'll talk about the concept of the new Negro and individuals from Charles Johnson here and James Weldon Johnson, Carter Woodson, and especially Marcus Garvey. And we will also at least briefly discuss some of the individuals associated with the artistic movement in New York City known as the Harlem Renaissance. First of all, the term New Negro is actually coined by Booker T. Washington. So this is not a brand new concept here in the 1920s. But it's adopted and you might even say adapted by Black people in cities in the North in the 1920s who actually rejected Booker T. Washington's accommodationist message. To them, the idea of the new Negro meant that you demanded social and political equality and rejected the idea of assimilation. That is the idea of becoming white or adapting, evolving into white society. For advocates of the new Negro, it was about taking pride in your African heritage instead. So reject this idea that we must become like white people. Instead, embrace your African heritage and roots and develop a culture of political ideology, communities, whatever it may be, of your own based upon that, as opposed to, again, assimilating into white culture. Create a distinct African-American culture, in other words. You've already seen this. We talked about jazz and blues before. Those would be hand in hand with this concept. They'd be exemplary of this, in other words. Well, this ideology also takes hold in organizations like the NAACP, which we've already discussed, and also the Urban League. Urban League was also headquartered in New York, but had offices in over 30 cities all throughout the country, in which it organized boycotts of downtown businesses that refused to hire Black people and that segregated their facilities. They also pressured those cities for better housing, better sanitation in Black neighborhoods, and so on. Think about this. You learn in school about the civil rights movement as if it were something that occurs in the 1950s and 60s. It just comes out of nowhere and then goes away. And here we are in the 1920s talking about an organization that you may well have never heard of, the Urban League, dedicated to using boycotts, nonviolent protests, to bring about an erosion of segregation, and also working, pressuring governments, local governments, to improve conditions in Black neighborhoods. This kind of thing doesn't fit neatly into the kind of narrative that we like to tell in the sort of grade school level, where the civil rights movement, again, kind of crops up after World War II and disappears after 1965 or 68. The individual at top center there is Charles Johnson, who becomes the director of research for the Urban League and the editor of the League's academic journal, Opportunity. Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, it's subtitled. Opportunity featured sociological research done either by or about Black people, or both. And also the works, the artistic works of Black essayists, poets, and so on. Johnson was a graduate of the University of Chicago who had, as a young man, witnessed firsthand that city's quote-unquote race riot that we talked about that was occasioned by the murder of that young boy who happened to drift into the wrong waters of Lake Michigan. He publishes The Negro in Chicago. It's a book. It's a sociological study of African Americans in that city. The Negro in Chicago, 1922, which sought to explain the violence associated with that race riot through a systematic study of environmental and structural factors. This is a rigorous academic study of, hey, why the hell did this happen? How could this happen, and why here? It becomes the fundamental text that is the fundamental work or book of what they call the Chicago School of Sociology. In academia, when you have a group of scholars who follow a certain set of, you might say, best practices associated with one individual and their work, or one key work, or a set of works, perhaps a canon of works, you call that the fill-in-the-blank school. It's not an actual school, it's just scholars who kind of think and write about things in that way. Like, if I were to somehow write some masterwork of history, which I'm not going to do, but if I were to publish some great path-breaking book that changed the way we think about history, and then I influenced many students who wrote about it the same way, they would say, yeah, that's the Bagley School or the Georgia State School of History, right? Well, Charles Johnson was such a figure when it comes to sociology. The basis of the Chicago School may seem like common sense to you, and probably ought to, but you use facts to dispel racism. It's the same thing that Ida Wells had done when we looked at the Red Record and her work on lynching, which many of you mentioned in the quiz. You use facts to dispel these racist theories of genetics, or what they called eugenics back then, the idea that one race is superior to another, and as they evolve or devolve over time, you could study that using certain characteristics of race and so on. You dispel that with facts. Du Bois himself had published a similar study, and so even though the Negro in Chicago by Johnson becomes the core text, the canonical text, if you will, the Philadelphia Negro by Du Bois actually preceded it by 20 years. Du Bois published that in 1899. Johnson moved to Harlem to join the Urban League in the 1920s. And we talked about his work with the Urban League. But he later moves back south. He'd been born in Virginia, by the way, if I didn't mention that. But he moves back south eventually after his time in Harlem, and he joins Fisk University, which we've talked about, one of the earliest HBCUs, which is in Nashville. He joins Fisk as the chair of social sciences there. And that is where he trained sociologists who would systematically study black life in the South in the same way that he had approached the race riots in Chicago in his seminal work. He publishes in 1934, Shadow of the Plantation, and in 1941, Growing Up in the Black Belt. So you don't have to know all these titles, but the point is he shifts his focus when he moves south and joins Fisk. He then sets about studying the South in the same way he had studied Chicago and that Du Bois had studied Philadelphia, using the same methodology from the Negro in Chicago, but looking at the South. He eventually becomes the first black president of Fisk in 1947. The NAACP, meanwhile, at the same time, increased its membership in the 1920s to over 100,000. You don't need to memorize these numbers, but 100,000 members in over 300 chapters all across the United States. Especially under the leadership of the individual in the middle, James Weldon Johnson, the first black executive secretary of the NAACP. His major initiative was a $1 a year membership drive. A real focus, a real push to increase the NAACP's membership during this time. And during which time the organization becomes majority black. Recall that it had not been so initially. It was a biracial organization early on, and remains so, but becomes majority black under the leadership of Johnson. Committed still, though, to interracial cooperation. Johnson himself was a poet and a musician who had moved to New York City from Florida during the Great Migration. He becomes part, then, of the Harlem Renaissance, which itself, in some ways, is an outgrowth of that Great Migration. He writes the song, "Lift Every Voice and Sing," which remains known to many as the Negro national anthem. Certainly it is still associated with the NAACP. Lift every voice and sing. He attended Atlanta University, graduated in 1894. He actually served in the United States Foreign Service. He was the consul to Venezuela and then Nicaragua under President Teddy Roosevelt. He compiled and then published old Negro spirituals, that is, old Christian hymn-type songs that slaves would sing in the quarters and in the fields and plantations of the South. Things that would have, either died out to history or only been passed on through oral tradition. He's able to get those, published and into the scholarly record for subsequent generations to study. He also publishes Black Manhattan about Harlem. So like Johnson, here's a guy who systematically studies both the cities of the North and the South using more or less the same methodology. And guess what? He also later moved south to teach at Fisk. In fact, he'd been encouraged to go down there by Charles Johnson. When he gets to Fisk, he becomes the chair of creative writing and literature at that university. The NAACP doesn't see a ton of the kind of major success we would associate with the NAACP in the classical phase of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. But there are some successes. There's the Buchanan versus Worley decision in 1917, in which the Supreme Court strikes down state and municipal laws mandating residential segregation, that is, mandating by law that neighborhoods be segregated by race. That did not, of course, bring an end to segregation in neighborhoods or anywhere else, but it just meant that, hey, you state and local governments can't outright say, here's a law that says you folks can't live in the same neighborhood. And so it gets enforced in a million different ways that we'll talk about, especially in the New Deal lecture coming up. But it's a minor victory, nonetheless. There were frustrations too. The NAACP wasn't just engaged in civil litigation, so this Buchanan case would be the result of them suing state and local governments. That's civil litigation, when you sue somebody. They were engaged in criminal litigation too. They tried to defend Black people who had been falsely accused of crimes or being otherwise railroaded in the legal system or legally lynched, you might say. Including the Scottsboro Boys, which I believe we're going to watch a film on the Scottsboro Boys here pretty soon. So I won't go into that other than to say these are a group of young Black men who were falsely accused of rape in Alabama in the 1920s and are sentenced to die. And the NAACP attempts to represent them, but is ultimately undercut by the Communist Party of the United States. It ends up representing most of those young men. So don't worry, the film will deal with that in enough detail. The NAACP also supports an anti-lynching bill, the Dyer anti-lynching bill that would have made it a federal crime to engage in lynching, but it repeatedly fails thanks to white Southern opposition, which would continue through the 1930s. The final individual here, bottom right, is Carter Woodson, a history PhD from Harvard. So like Du Bois, he has his PhD in history from Harvard University, historically America's oldest and top institution of higher learning. And like Charles Johnson and James Weldon Johnson, Carter Woodson becomes a leading black intellectual of his time. He establishes the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915, which promoted black history in public institutions. Well, in institutions of education and in the public, I should say. So in schools and in just in the public in general, the promotion of the concept of black history, which may seem sort of obvious to us, or maybe not, but it certainly would not have been an obvious topic of study at the time outside of these few examples of scholars that we're talking about. In essence, to put it another way, Woodson takes the kind of work that Johnson and Johnson, if you will, were doing and brings it to the general public, or attempts to. Not everybody is reading scholarly works or attending Fisk or Harvard or whatever. So when he establishes the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, this is his attempt to promote that for the public. He also founded the academic journal, the Journal of Negro History, which is still published to this day by the University of Chicago Press. He also published the Negro History Bulletin, which made black history available to educators and students in the general public all throughout the country. So he's engaged on the sort of high scholarly end of things in academia, while he is at the same time attempting to bring the study of black history to the general public and to K through 12 schools even. He eventually joins the faculty at Howard. You remember Howard is an HBCU we've talked about. You remember where Howard is? I told you about Fisk in Nashville. Where's Howard?
Chicago?
Good guess.
Howard's in Atlanta, right?
Another very good guess. Morehouse and Spelman and Clark are Atlanta. Howard's in D.C.
Oh, never mind.
Washington, D.C.
Never mind.
Yeah.
I'm confused.
Hey, we all are. But yeah, no, it's unfair. I've thrown at you like all these million different HBCUs and they're all over the place. So. Howard is in Washington, D.C., and eventually Carter Woodson becomes dean of that institution and establishes the idea of a Negro History Week in February, when you have the birthdays of both Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass in close proximity. Established as something to be observed by schools and other organizations every February, this eventually becomes Black History Month, as we still celebrate today. It's not until the 1970s that happens, but it happens eventually. The point being that Woodson is sometimes referred to as the father of Negro history. Questions about any of these individuals? If not, then we proceed to Garvey. Garvey is not born in America, but that is where the majority of his career, I guess you might say, is spent, till he's kicked out. Garvey's born in Jamaica in 1887. He was born along the coast in a rural area of Jamaica, on an island in the Caribbean, a former British sugar colony. He moves to the city of Kingston, which is the major city, the capital of Jamaica. You've been? Nice. When?
Starting the year.
Cool. Well, you have to tell me about that.
Wait, where'd you go?
To the.
You spent time in Kingston? It's a big city, right?
Scary.
Yeah, I can imagine. What did you do there?
We went cliff jumping. We just chilled at the beach.
That's cool. That's great. Yeah, a lot of people that will go there from here go to like these resorts and stuff. And that's not what I want to do. Yeah. Well, that's not the authentic experience anyway, right? Go to Kingston, walk around, right? Kingston probably too. You could I guess you'd probably say is one of, if that's like with New Orleans and jazz, it's one of, if not the birthplace of reggae music, and where Bob Marley comes up and other folks associated with that genre. But that is where Garvey grows up, but he spends much of his time then abroad. And before he ends up in the United States, he's all over the Caribbean and Latin America, where he's exposed to the terrible conditions that peasant folk, poor people, still endured on plantations, be it sugar plantations, banana plantations, or whatever. So he becomes a labor leader, an organizer for these people. He becomes a journalist, trying to expose to the public the conditions that poor people worked in throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. Spends a lot of time in London, back in England, where he was influenced by a spirit of anti-colonialism associated with the nations of Africa that had been colonized by Britain and other European nations in the imperialist period of the late 1800s. There's a movement of African nationalism, anti-colonialism, that is, freedom and independence for those nations that had been colonized and were being exploited by the industrialized nations of Western Europe, like Britain. In other words, is a strive for African peoples to again have self-determination instead of colonial domination and economic exploitation. Again, with Garvey, like the previous three individuals we looked at, you see somebody who's influenced by Booker T. Washington, but will develop a message very different from that of Washington. He would embrace Washington's emphasis on racial pride and racial unity, but he actually proffers the idea, instead of assimilation, of separatism. The idea that, hand in hand with the notion of the new Negro, you didn't need to assimilate into white culture. You could develop an African American culture or an Afro-Caribbean culture, in his case, all your own. And speaking of African American versus Afro-Caribbean, Garvey is among those who begins to espouse Pan-Africanism. The idea of bringing together what we would call the African diaspora. When you have a diaspora, you have a people who have been scattered about. In this case, people from Africa who had been forcibly brought into the Western Hemisphere in a state of slavery from everywhere from Brazil to Colombia to Virginia to Jamaica. So Garvey is among those who begins to suggest that all of the black or African peoples of the diaspora ought to consider themselves as intimately linked together, as part of one greater black nation. And that they ought to work together for their own betterment, for the betterment of all. Hand in hand with this, then, is black nationalism. The idea that black people, either in America or elsewhere, could constitute a nation within a nation. That there should be black nation states, maybe even one greater black state for, quote, those at home and abroad. And so for a lot of black people in the New World, this meant joining the Back to Africa movement. The idea that perhaps you'd be better served to leave this land of colonialism and oppression and slavery and return to the homeland. Garvey also promotes economic nationalism. The idea that, it's not just about segregation. The idea that for black advancement to occur, there needed to be more black businesses, more black hotels and restaurants and banks, more places like Sweet Auburn and Atlanta that we talked about. There weren't a lot of those places. Black people often lived in communities where the businesses, the banks, and everything else were owned by white people. And Garvey suggests for advancement to occur, that needed to change. he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. And he grows it through advancing all of these ideas we've just looked at: Pan-Africanism, black nationalism, economic nationalism, but also through his sensational oratory. He's an incredible orator. And he's able to bring in elements. You look at the way he's dressed in the two images at top. He's able to bring in like quasi-religious tone to his oratory and to the organization, and also an almost militant one. And you see him in the sort of pseudo-military looking dress here too. And certainly this is a much more militant movement than anything you could say of the movement associated with Washington. Perhaps even more so than that associated with Du Bois. Speaking of Du Bois, calls him dangerous and a lunatic, a leader of a cult. So these two were not friends. Garvey in turn criticized the light-skinned Du Bois, reminding him that he is not only mixed race, but also from the North, and never had to deal with the kind of oppression that somebody would in a post-slavery society. Just to present Garvey warts and all, not only was he critical of mixed race people like Du Bois, he also was highly critical of Jewish people. And he moves to Harlem eventually in the 19-teens, begins growing the Universal Negro Improvement Association such that within a few years it had 2 million members in 30 chapters in the United States and the Caribbean, and by 1922 it would be 4 million. A massive organization that you maybe have never heard of, that doesn't get told in this popular civil rights history that we get here in this country. In 1919, though, we see an example of where Garvey fell short. Beyond perhaps his anti-Semitism, but Garvey fell short in creating the Black Star Line, a steamship company whose aim it was to connect black people in the old and new worlds. This is part of the Back to Africa movement. Black Star Line was supposed to be the steamship company that would carry black people back and forth to Africa. And he sold stock in the company at $5 a share, but financial wrongdoing is uncovered, and he is convicted of mail fraud. Now, when I say he fell short here, and that's true, it was a failed venture, but let me emphasize that this was probably a case of selective prosecution, meaning they went after Garvey. And they were going to find whatever they could to take this dangerous individual and throw him behind bars if they could. In fact, right down the road in Atlanta, in the federal penitentiary, where he serves 2 years for mail fraud. Again, it's a political prosecution. It's a selective prosecution. So was the Black Star Line a bungled operation? Yes, but Garvey didn't set out to create something criminal. They went after him and found a technicality and threw him in prison on it because he's dangerous. He's a labor leader, he's a separatist, he's militant. They see him like a revolutionary. There's some context here too. America at that time was in the throes of the Red Scare. And I know that's not on the PowerPoint, but it's important. There's a revolution in Russia, and revolutionary socialists take control of the government and become the Communist Party. And the thinking was, well, if it could happen in Russia, it could happen elsewhere. And they begin to associate anybody who's a labor leader, anybody they see as radical is associated with that kind of threat. And so the backlash here, Garvey's prosecution is probably part of that. And he's eventually deported upon his release from prison, kicked out of the country, has to continue his activism from Jamaica and from London until his death in 1940. He is incredibly influential. He is years ahead of his time, and influences a number of movements, most especially the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s and beyond that we'll study in here in a few weeks. Also highly influential of an organization known as the Nation of Islam that we'll study here in a few weeks. I mentioned reggae music and Bob Marley. Those people are generally followers of a religion known as Rastafarianism. Garvey is influential in terms of Rastafarianism as well. Questions about Garvey or anything else?
Can you repeat what the Red Scare is?
So the Red Scare was this terrible hysterical fear of communism. It follows the end of World War I, or the Great War that we just talked about, during which there was a revolution in Russia in which the communists come to power. And if you're a capitalist, you see communism as an existential or a grave threat. And you begin to see it as poor working people who are in labor unions, like they're threatening to take all your stuff and take your freedoms. And it's a hysteria. It's an illogical hysteria. And the way it manifests in this period of time is mostly against immigrants. And this is a trend in American history. Over and over and over again, Americans get scared shitless, and they project that fear into anger and blame against immigrants. And then the kind of immigrants changes over time. Used to be, it was, the Irish. And then it was Italians and Polish people, or the Chinese on the West Coast, and of course Latinos now. Garvey was part of this because he's like the trifecta. He's an immigrant, he's a labor leader, and a militant one at that, and he's black. So he's stirring up the seeds of a black revolution in America, in the eyes of some of these white leaders. And that's why they deported him. Does that make sense? Well, let's look finally then at the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem, as you know, by the 1920s had become this cultural mecca for Black America. The place where if you were an artist, you wanted to go. The place where it was all happening, if you will. There was a sort of, to tie this in with what we've just been talking about, it was the hub of a new Negro arts movement. The core tenet of which was we don't need to adopt or show that we can adapt to or perfect white art or culture more broadly. We can create our own African American art forms. We already saw that with jazz and blues, which have by this time made their way to Harlem. But here you can see the work of poets, of novelists, visual artists, dancers and choreographers, and yes, of course, already we've seen musicians. Similar to Garvey and Uniah, they embraced their African heritage and sought to create a truly African-American culture. They wanted to, quote, affirm the value of blackness, something that had been devalued systematically in America for generations. Affirm the value of blackness. And I want you to think here about the stereotypes and the absurdity of minstrelsy, some of you haven't talked about that in the quiz. They wanted to, quote, present authentic versions of the African American experience, not stereotypes or caricatures. Remember the confines, the limits that a Burt Williams or a Bojangles had in which to operate when they had to adopt a black minstrelsy that sought to kind of subtly undermine stereotypes. Well, here it's an outright rejection of those stereotypes and an attempt to present something authentic, an actual portrayal of what it was like to be black in America. Generally speaking, these people were not quite the separatists that you would see in the followers of Garvey. And so they kind of walk a line somewhere between the ideology of Garvey and that of perhaps Du Bois. And speaking of Du Bois, they found receptive publishers in Crisis. Remember, the Crisis is the publication of the NAACP that Du Bois was editor of for quite a long time. And in Opportunity, which we just looked at, that is the publication of Charles Johnson and the Urban League. So NAACP's Crisis, Urban League's Opportunity, these are places where you could get published. They also were able to publish in The Messenger. You remember we talked about A. Philip Randolph, leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, labor leader for A. Philip Randolph. He published Harlem Renaissance type works in The Messenger as well. So we're talking about essays, poetry, art, excerpts from novels that were released in serial form, for example. I want to zero in though on Zora Neale Hurston. Anybody read any Zora Neale Hurston? She is born in Notasulga, which is a small town in East Alabama, not far from where I went to high school. But she moves at an early age to Eatonville, Florida. You don't have to know the town names. But she grew up in Florida. Kind of north central Florida, I believe, is where Eatonville is. She studies literature and philosophy at Howard, which we were just talking about in D.C., under a man named Alan Locke, who encouraged her and many others to move to Harlem. Alan Locke, I'll write his name now. Spelled like the English philosopher John Locke, which we've been talking about in my U.S. class.
Wait, he did what?
He is her teacher at Howard. He is an influence upon her and many others, where she's studying, again, literature and philosophy at Howard. Locke is her mentor. And he is the one who encourages her and many others to Harlem. He's the great scholar who's pushing these young artists to move to New York City and be part of this movement. And Locke publishes much of his students' work in The New Negro in 1921, the aptly titled The New Negro in 1921, an anthology of essays and poetry and art produced by these young writers and artists. Hurston herself publishes a collection of short stories about contemporary black life. I say a collection, she publishes numerous in various outlets, numerous pieces in various different outlets, including in Fire, a literary magazine, co-founded by her friend, the poet and essayist Langston Hughes. Ever read any Langston Hughes? Well, you might be about to. Hughes and Hurston were not afraid to write about edgy subjects at the time. Things that maybe wouldn't be edgy now, or certainly wouldn't be in some cases, that were very edgy at the time. Homosexuality, bisexuality, interracial relationships, prostitution, color prejudice, meaning on the part of black people, like we saw with Garvey criticizing Du Bois because he's light-skinned, and so on. On Hughes, let's see. Hoping to read on his birthday, which is apparently February 1st. Huh. Imagine that this was written 3 years ago and how true is it today. In our country, it sadly seems, sometimes, it feels as if not much has changed. Yeah, no shit. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be the land where every man is free. The land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand is the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Which others do I want to read? This is probably his most famous or one of them. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sword and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Well, it's exploding right now in places like Louisville, so. Timeless are many of the works of Langston Hughes, and I'll leave you to explore those for yourself. There's several more in there that are fantastic. The cover art for, do I have Bustle